right, next up is MVC, which builds right on top of JSP. So take it away.
So MVC is, it's not fully in the Jakarta EE spec yet. It's kind of a candidate for the next one. It's been kicked around for a couple of years now. I've used it, I quite like it. But also it's one of those ones where the name itself doesn't really tell you a lot about what it is, because it just says MVC, which is very broad. And if you've been doing XPages development for a while, you might think, well, aren't we already doing MVC? Isn't XPages MVC? And yes-ish. And that's why the name of this doesn't do much to convey what it is. I will start with a little bit about like MVC as the concept. So it stands for Model View Controller, and it's an architecture for developing applications. It's not specific to web apps, although it does play particularly well with the web app model. And the idea of it is that you have your models, which is something like person or company or whatever, your business nouns, that will be, these are the things that I'm going to interact with one way or another. So I might end up showing them in a list, I might end up creating a new one, deleting one, whatever, but like model is over here, it's its own thing, and that's separated out. And then on the other side of it, you have the C, which is the controller, and that's the thing that will handle interactions. And so the way that works is that there's something that's going to handle user does something, and then how am I going to deal with that? So the controller might be something like user deleted document, in which case it will reach into the model and say delete this document. It might be user requested seeing a list of documents, in which case it'll get the model and then also go to the final component, the V, the one in the middle, the view, and then say this is what's actually being displayed to the user. So the view, in this sense, I mean, in Domino we have view all over the place, like it's so heavily overloaded. But in this case, what view means is this is the thing that the user is seeing. Like that's where the view comes from, is like what the user is seeing. In a web sense, that's HTML. So the view is the HTML page that you've loaded up. And the idea is that somewhere in an MVC system, you have the models being stored somewhere, the view being the thing that the user interacts with, and the controller ferrying actions between those. In XPages and JSF before and after it, the controller is kind of subsumed into the whole stack. So JSF is billed as an MVC thing, but you don't generally write controllers. Like the things that I've called controllers that a lot that gained some traction, they'd be better referred to as presenters. There's a MVP, I think, model view presenter paradigm that fits that well. So now I have to just go back and rename them. But the idea is like they're not controllers in the sense of a full MVC stack. The controller is the thing that will handle all of these things. So in JSF and XPages, you don't really deal with the controller as such. It is there. There are classes that are referred to as controllers in the stack, but it's still like faces controller and things like that. It's a little weird. It's all kind of like implied by other stuff that's going on. And then in XPages specifically, we have the view is the X page, but because of the way Domino works and because of the way we were kind of told to do XPages development, the view often handles the model as well, and it handles everything. So like if you have an XP Domino document, technically speaking, that's a model, like it's referred to as a model in the back end, but then you're just writing code on there that says like this is first name, this is last name, and you're writing stuff that says replace item value or get item value and that sort of thing. And it's like, well, you're really stretching some of these definitions quite a bit, and you have to really go out of your way to do it because of the way XPages works, bleeding together the model and the view. In a JSF context, ideally what you'd be doing there is ferrying everything through managed beans, and so managed beans would be sort of not your controller, but used by the controller as a mediator. In XPages, you can do that. Some people have, and it can work as far as it does in JSF as well. So there's that version of MVC. What this specification is a little more of a direct, like by the numbers, by the letters, in this case one. So there is no implied controller. What you do with the MVC spec is you write the controllers. So if I go to my code, I have here, it's this MVC example. And so a controller in the MVC spec sense, as in like this implementation, is a Jakarta REST service. So you write a service here. I'm saying the path is MVC. So up until that point, like with the path and the @get and @produces, this is identical to the Jakarta REST stuff we talked about properly Jakarta REST, but Jakarta REST stuff we had talked about before. So it's
Yep.
built on the same REST services mechanism. So it inherits all of that stuff. It inherits all the same capabilities as far as passing parameters in and all that sort of thing. What it adds is that now you say at controller. And what this means is that this class should be treated specially as a controller. And you can do that per method as well. And that conveys a couple capabilities. The big one, well, there's two big ones. One is that you get this models object. And so what this is you say, this is a models object. This is effectively a map. You can think of it as similar to view scope or request scope. But it's meant to be, here's the thing that you put your models into, and then they become available in the page that you eventually render. So the way that a controller class will usually work will be something like this, where you'd say, I'm going to listen for a GET request at the MVC path in my application. I'm going to allow a query parameter named foo, and then you do some logic with that. So here, this is for testing purposes mostly. I'm going to say, put the term incoming foo in the models, and this will be just what the user passed in. This would probably most likely be something, for example, if you say, I want to query vacation requests in the last month. The query parameter might be the starting date of the vacation requests, and then you'd say, find, however you do it in your stack, find vacation requests matching that, then put those into the models, and then the view will handle those. So the controller class here does the work of saying, I have accepted a request coming from the user. I'm going to communicate with the model layer. So right now in this example, and this will be for the next spec, right now there's no model layer present really, other than this kind of container for stuff. So I'm putting a string in there, but you can definitely imagine that as like a list of employees or a list of vacation requests or something like that. It will do any additional logic that you need. So, it might reject a request based on some kind of state of the application. This will build along, like how with Jakarta REST resources will do parameter validation coming in. So you could say that the query parameter foo is required. In this case, it's not, but it will handle all that stuff. So again, this is combining multiple specs where it's saying we're building on Jakarta REST, which means we already get the bean validation stuff. We get the parsing and handling coming in. We get you could do a bean param where it breaks things out into multiple things. So it has all these things, and then now what it's saying is, okay, now I'm going to return the view that is what's actually rendering this. So this is, this is where JSP pays off a little bit more, but this is also pluggable. So I'm going to show rendering a JSP page, but you can write additional ones. So for example, there are some stock ones that I haven't integrated into this for things like time leaf and things like that, where you have a different view language. I'm considering what kind of options I'd have for XPages. I might be able to do that. We'll see. But for now, I'm just saying you render this. So the way this works is that it comes into the controller, you do your logic, and then say, now show the user this JSP page. So I call it MVC.JSP. And so if I go to look at that, I look over here, and it looks similar to the JSP page from earlier. And what I'm doing is saying, here is the thing that I got from the model. I can also reach into CDI managed beans like this. So I have my application guy and request guy. I have implicit managed beans. So I have providers for the current database session. And then here's this other thing that I got from the models. So if I go here, I can see all of this stuff in action. So this is rendering the JSP page. The URL here is, it has this XSP because it's within kind of the Jakarta REST thing, XSP/app/MVC, which is the add path that I have in here. And then I include foo equals bar. So you'll note there's no .jsp, which is always kind of nice. Like you do have the XSP preceding it, but what you're really doing is making a request to this Jakarta REST resource, which has no extension to it. And then it will incidentally be a JSP file, but it doesn't have to be. It could be any number of other things. So the MVC spec handles this varying between incoming request. You just say, I want a controller, and then call it, and then you can, in this case, it'll happen to be a JSP. It could be other things as well. And then it will say, this is going to be HTML. I will render this. And so the virtue of this is that this is sort of a REST API first approach. Like you don't necessarily need to have other REST APIs, but for example, say you're saying I have a Jakarta REST resource called employees, and I have a @get that produces JSON, and I have an @get that produces HTML. So if a REST client, like a programmatic client, requests this URL and says I will accept JSON, it will give you JSON back. If a web browser goes there, it will give you HTML back because it's going with its other thing. So you kind of like build that and say, I'm focusing first on building my API. And secondarily, now I can have parts of it that this is the human version and then this is the machine version, but it's in that same place. And what you're dealing with is the employee's endpoint. So here I just have the endpoint MVC, but you can have definitely other components to it. That will come into play when I start talking about like, well, what will your model layer be, which is the which will be the final part of this collection of specifications. But this is one of those things where it's starting to bring things together, where you have JAX-RS and now you can use JSP as your page language, and so you have much more of a my entry point is this REST service that has some capabilities that, you know, sometimes it's producing XML, sometimes it's producing JSON, sometimes it's producing web pages, and then you get really solid control over the structure of your application. Things start to make more sense because they're more consistent. Like if you want to know where the employees list is coming from, you go to your employees resource. You don't go to try to find a different page named something else that's kind of unrelated and look at a different place. You know, that's always one of the problems with a XPages based application, where everything you kind of have to like read the names of things rather than here's the centralized controller. But here it's controller first. That's where you're writing your code, and then dealing with other components is much more explicit, much simpler. And it's a different way of doing it. As we'll get to, and this will be primarily for the next session as well, one thing to really know about this is the big difference between these approaches to MVC is that, you know, where XPages and JSF have that kind of implicit controller, some of the stuff that does is handles partial refreshes, things like that, and handles like what does a post mean, what is that kind of thing. Like, for example, if in an XPage you're saying I want to I want to create a new document, what you do is you have a button that says save document effectively, and it handles all the stuff about like, oh, that's going to be a post to this URL, and then it will reload or redirect you in a certain way. But what you would do here is you would have an endpoint that's marked with @post, and then you would have it so that it saves the document and then does a redirect. So you handle that post action. There's nothing implicit. There's nothing that handles anything that you haven't told it to handle. But that does mean you can do @delete. So if you have a delete request coming in, and there's some stuff to handle the fact that browsers don't do @delete as part of the form, but it handles that for you. It has these capabilities where you specifically say these are the actions that are there. So if you write a button on a page, then you say point to this URL and that will be your action. And then if you say this is a post to this URL, you then write a method here that says @post, and then this is the thing that handles that. There's nothing that, you know, it doesn't restore state like it does in XPages. It's a very different kind of programming model. Much like JSP alone, I wouldn't say rewrite all XPages in this, but it is a different thing, and now it's starting to come together a little more than just with JSP. And this is starting to become, this is a real way to structure your applications. It is a little, in some ways, lower level. In some ways, it's nice that it's the same level as your REST services. And so it has these trade-offs. It is very interesting. And so it creates this kind of different way of architecting your applications. You know, still called MVC, like XPages calls itself, but it's a different kind of MVC. And it is referred to as action-oriented. I think if you've done Spring development, they have a similar that predates this one by a good, like this is essentially a Jakarta version of the Spring version of MVC, I think. And like that's a model that's worked very well there. So if you start writing your app in this way, it's a very, very good, very nice way to write your applications. It's not the same way as in XPages, but it is a very interesting way to do things, and one that I've grown quite fond of, in fact. And then, you know, in the final video in this series, we'll get into kind of pulling a lot of this stuff together more with actually then dealing with data. Since so far it's just been very abstract, saying, well, who cares if you can admit the thing that came into the URL on the page? What you really want to start doing is, okay, I want to actually write an app with this, and that'll come in the final one.
Thank you for saying that, because I'm sitting here going, okay, examples. I want to understand exactly how I can use this in a real life situation. So let's go there next.
All right.